So it is 2 p.m. today, Tuesday, and we are here for another edition of Tenant Tuesdays at 2. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kadeem Morris. I am an attorney in the housing unit here at Community Legal Services, and welcome back to Tenant Tuesdays at 2, a conversation about topics related to rental housing issues that tenants in Philadelphia are currently facing. This is a production of the Philadelphia Eviction Prevention Project. Every week, we will cover a different topic related to renters in Philadelphia and give you the most up-to-date information that you can use both to advocate for yourself, and we will also give you resources, whether it's in the form of the possibility of legal representation or just information that you need to know. You can check out our website, www.phillytenant.org, or if you need personal advice or possible legal representation, you can call our tenant hotline, 267-443-2500. Again, that's 267-443-2500. Today, I am joined by Orani Chikma Oravi and Vikram Patel, two staff attorneys within the housing unit here at CLS, and we are going to have what I think is going to be a very exciting conversation about the CARES Act. As I think most of you are aware, the federal government has put out some new legislation that affects and protects renters across the nation, and in particular renters in Philadelphia. So we wanted to do a special program for you today and kind of talk through the CARES Act protections and give you the most up-to-date information onto how you can self-advocate. So as you should be able to see on your screens, both Vikram and Orani are here with us today. So before we get started, I just want to give a brief update on some recent happenings with the courts. The courts are now closed until July 1st. That's all courts in Philadelphia. That was done by an order of the First Judicial District earlier this month. So that's a major win and major protection for tenants in general, both public and private. So that means that if you are facing an eviction, or if you feel like you are being evicted between now and June 1st, that is an illegal eviction. So that is something that you should be aware of. You can contact us for additional information or contact the cops if it's an immediate issue that's happening as we speak. The Fair Housing Commission is also continuing to accept electronic filings. So you can file a complaint and raise affirmative rights that you have as a tenant around habitability issues with the Fair Housing Commission through their online system. So I think for today, we are going to jump right in and get the conversation started on the Federal CARES Act. And the first question to our panelists today is, what is the CARES Act and what protection does it offer for our tenants in Philadelphia?
Sure. Well, so the CARES Act first, it's a big law. Like there are a lot of pages in this law, but we're only be talking about one section, which are the protections for tenants. So the CARES Act, it was signed into law on March 27th and essentially put in a 120-day period in which some landlords, and Orani will be talking a little bit later about who exactly, but some landlords cannot do the three following things, which is one, for non-payment of rent, they cannot charge you any late fees, cannot send you an eviction notice, and cannot also file for an eviction. So one of the things to keep in mind, as you know, Kadeem just said that the courts are closed until June, but the CARES Act for certain properties extends this until July 25th. So the reason why this is important is that usually when you're going to be evicted, there are several steps involved with an eviction. First, your landlord has to provide you with notice and then actually file an eviction case. So the CARES Act prevents a landlord for certain properties from being able to do either of those things until July 25th. So if a landlord does try to evict you without doing those things, it is an illegal eviction, and we have plenty of resources. Here on Tenant Tuesday, I think a couple weeks ago, we had a great video, which I suggest you check out. And then also on phillytenant.org, we have a great flyer where that provides you with some information about legal eviction. But basically, if your landlord is doing any of these things, call the tenant hotline. Once again, 267-443-2500, and we can help you with the specifics involved there.
I think that's a great bit of information for our tenants to know that the CARES Act is out there and pushes everything basically on till July 25th. And in my mind, I'm thinking about people who may not necessarily have been subject to a court proceedings prior to this date, but who were behind on their rent and maybe received a notice from their landlord saying, I may potentially start eviction proceedings with you, but they haven't done so yet. Are those people covered by these protections?
Yeah, I mean, if you're one of these properties, you know, that's something that your landlord should not be doing. They should not be sending you any sort of notice, you know, saying that they're trying to they're going to be taking any action to evict you until July 25th. You know, the CARES Act. You know, it's part of the federal response to the pandemic, and we don't want people to be essentially self-evicting. You know, if you know, right now it's incredibly hard to find housing. It's, you know, essentially also unsafe, you know, to be looking at places. It's so any behavior that a landlord would be taking to you know, like sending notices to try to get someone to self-evict, or, you know, threatening someone to threaten to evict someone right now, you know, goes against that. It goes against public safety, and it goes against the law.
So July 25th is that benchmark date that I think most people should be paying attention to. So what happens on July 25th, or let's say the morning of July 26th?
Yeah, that's the end of the moratorium. But there's one more part of the CARES Act that is relevant here, which is, you know, usually, you know, an eviction notice, you know, it has, say, like, you know, usually say like 10 days, you know, it has a fairly short window for the notice itself. But after July 25th, a landlord, if they're going to be trying to evict you for non-payment of rent during the moratorium period, so from March 27th to July 25th, then they need to give you a 30-day notice. I mean, part of what's going on here with the CARES Act is that, you know, we have widespread unemployment. We have, you know, a complete upset of our economy. A lot of people still haven't been able to get, you know, unemployment benefits that they've already applied for. I think last I heard it was like maybe half of the people who have applied for Pennsylvania unemployment have been able to actually get it. This period is also meant to give tenants flexibility. So that way you don't have to decide whether or not you want to, you know, pay your rent or pay for your food. This gives you the flexibility to, during the moratorium, maybe push off those payments until the end of the moratorium, when, you know, unemployment is finally coming in, or when, you know, your place of employment opens back up. And part of that also is to have that 30-day notice. So even after the moratorium, there's still another 30 days before a landlord can actually take you to court.
That's great. So just as a quick recap, as we go through, March 27th, the legislators, this was signed into law. So it created a 120-day eviction protection window for very specific properties, which we will get into. And as a part of that protection, there's the additional layer that if a landlord decides to institute an eviction proceedings after this day, let's say July 26th, which is the first applicable day, they now have to send a 30-day notice to their tenants before anything can get going. And I think, Ernie, this is kind of where I want to bring you into the conversation. Who are the people who are covered by this protection? Like, how does a tenant find out for themselves, am I covered by the CARES Act?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Kadeem. So we kind of break this down into two different buckets. One is what kind of tenant is protected, and then what's the issue that is protected. So the tenants who are protected, or the covered tenancies, are tenants who live in any kind of subsidized housing. So examples of that are public housing, Section 8 housing, both project-based or for tenants who have a Section 8 voucher. It's also known as the Housing Choice Voucher Program. Other examples are HUD multifamily housing, again, including the Section 8 project-based and senior housing. There's also continuum of care, permanent and transitional housing, which is a program that provides housing and resources for homeless and people in transitional housing. Also HOPWA and home funded housing. HOPWA stands for Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS. There's low income housing tax credit or LIHTC, which is another type of program. And properties with, and then there are also, in addition to those federally subsidized programs, also units that are owned privately, by a landlord, but the landlord has a federally backed mortgage. Those would also be covered as well. So those are the tenants and the tenancies that are covered. And then there is the issue that is covered. And these are, as Vikram already said, these are for non-payment of rent cases only. So what that doesn't include is termination of term or a breach of the lease. So if a tenant breached their lease in some other kind of way, they brought in a pet and they're not allowed to have pets in their lease, then that issue would not be covered under the CARES Act.
So I think those are two very important things. It's a very long list of property types that are covered. And then there's also the very important caveat to this, that if you are not being taken to court by your landlord on the basis of non-payment of rent, meaning that you haven't been able to pay your rent during this pandemic time, you are subject to your eviction case still proceeding. So theoretically, the courts may open on June 1st. And at that point in time, if you're at the end of your lease term, your landlord could still proceed with an eviction process against you. So that's a very important distinction to know. But if you are just behind on your rent and you are in a federally protected property, your landlord cannot proceed in this way.
Yeah, that's right.
So I think that brings me to the next question. Who isn't covered by the CARES Act? Because I know it's easy for some people who might have like an existing relationship with the housing authority to know that, like, okay, I may be covered. But for the average renter, how would they know if they're covered by the CARES Act, or who isn't covered by the CARES Act?
Yeah, so who's not covered are tenants where their landlords filed their case before the moratorium took effect. And that, again, the effective date was March 27th, or those that are filed after July 25th, 2020. Other cases that are not covered, what we discussed earlier about, those if you're in a tenancy that isn't one of those that we discussed earlier. And then also, again, where the case or the eviction is based on a different reason other than non-payment of rent, right? So breach of the lease, termination of term, none of those would be covered under the CARES Act.
So I think that's super important and bears repeating, that if your landlord had filed an eviction case against you prior to March 25th, you're not covered by the CARES Act, regardless of the issue of your eviction. But if they filed after that date, you are definitely within the group of people protected by this legislation. And that kind of answers my next question of tenants who are already behind, if they're covered, which I assume the answer is no, it only applies to new cases. So
right. So yeah, and also to your question earlier about, if a landlord served a tenant with a notice, but they haven't filed yet, then that tenant is covered, right? Because the CARES Act also, it prohibits not just landlords from serving notices, but also prohibits them from filing new cases. So yeah, it only covers new cases, exactly.
So this is kind of the question for the second part of those protections, because in addition to people in what we call directly federally subsidized properties that you went through, Section 8, housing choice vouchers, HAPCO, all of those things, there's a second group of people, which are individuals whose landlords have federally backed mortgages, which I think it's there various news medias have said maybe 40% or something of mortgages out there might be subject to this protection. So how would a tenant know or go about finding out if their landlord has a property, private tenant, no subsidy directly to the tenant or the property? How would they find out if their landlord's has a federally backed mortgage?
Yeah, so they wouldn't. Tenants would have to contact their landlord to find out whether the landlord has a federally backed mortgage. You know, there are definitely some databases out there that folks can check out. Specifically, Fannie Mae. Oh, sorry. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They can check out those online tools to see. But really, you know, what we're telling advocates and the advice from National Housing Law Project, NHLP, is that we want to put the burden on the landlord to prove that they don't have a federally backed mortgage. So instead of putting the burden on the tenant. So yeah, the tenant won't really know. They're gonna definitely they can ask their landlord. Like I said, there are also some tools they can check out online. And I'll post those in the chat in a little bit as well. And then for, you know, some folks, it's hard to know which subsidized program folks are a part of. So the advice I would provide that we're providing around, you know, how can a tenant find out if they're not sure which program, like they know that, you know, 30% of their income is how their rent is calculated, or they do recertifications, but they're not sure whether they're in public housing or Section 8. You know, check your lease. That's the first place to start. There's also the preservationdatabase.org. So you can go there and register an account, and then, you know, look up your specific unit and your building. And it's also a little complicated. So, you know, if folks have questions, they can definitely give us a call at our hotline, and we can help out with that. And yeah, I guess it just bears repeating one more time that, you know, if you're a tenant and you're not sure if your landlord's mortgage is federally backed, you know, you can ask them, and they should know that the landlords have access to their mortgage documents, to their deed, to, you know, they can call the mortgage company. But the burden shouldn't be on the tenant to figure out whether or not their landlord has a federally backed mortgage.
So I think that definitely is some great information, and it bears pointing out that these individuals who are not in subsidized housing, but are in properties where their landlord maybe has a federally backed mortgage, that's not information that they will be able to find out affirmatively for themselves. So if you are out there and you are hearing that there is this great eviction moratorium or protection for people in subsidized housing or whose landlords have federally backed mortgages, your reaction or response should not be to just do nothing. Because if you are in that category, you kind of have to affirmatively start to engage in the conversation with your landlord and figure out, okay, will my landlord be willing to tell me if the property is federally backed or not? That's the first question. The second question is, if you are behind on your mortgage, I guess either you or Vikram can answer this question. What sort of strategies should the tenant engage in at that point in terms of just general advocacy for themselves with their landlords?
Well, I think one of the best things is open communication with your landlord. You know, if you're unable to pay your rent, try and work out a payment plan with your landlord. We have seen a fair bit of success, especially, you know, in these extraordinary times, with people being able to work out a payment plan where they can maybe defer payments until another time, or you know, work out a period of, you know, payments that are made over you know, a chunk of months. But essentially, I think the best thing to do is just to have open communication with your landlord, the situation, and try to work it out with them before it ends up going to court. If even though we have these defenses, the simple fact that an eviction is filed against someone also hurts. That's there's at least right now there's no way to have any sort of expungement. There's no way to really get rid of that record that someone has filed an eviction case for you, even if you win. And when future landlords search for that, they may see that there has been an eviction case, and maybe more reticence to rent. So I think the first most important thing is to have open communication with your landlord. Now, some landlords, right, as we've all experienced, aren't necessarily the most compassionate, or also some of these landlords may be strapped for cash themselves and maybe trying to collect money in order to make their payments, but for one reason or another, they're unwilling to work with a tenant. In those situations, I'd advise come seek us or call the tenant hotline. Once again, it's 267-443-2500, and we can help advise you through that situation.
And one more, just to add to that, if you do go the route of entering into an agreement, make sure that agreement is in writing. What we talk about and then what's actually in writing could be different things. And so just get that in writing. The best is to have like a document, but text messages, emails work really well as well. And just to be really mindful. I mean, it's such a chaotic and destabilizing time right now that you're not overpromising. You can negotiate with your landlord, or at least try. And again, as Vikram said, that's something that we can assist with. But ask for a waiver of rent. And of course, with the CARES Act, they're not allowed to seek, a waiver of rent or a waiver of late fees. And with the CARES Act, they're not allowed to ask for or charge late fees. But get it in writing. Make sure that you're not promising something that you really don't feel comfortable with.
I think this is a great place to kind of transition to what I think is the next part of the conversation. There are people who are living in public housing and Section 8 and other federally subsidized programs for whom there is avenues for them to proactively indicate or let the housing authority know that they've been affected by COVID-19. What should people in those situations really be doing if they've lost income, if their household size has changed? What are the best strategies for that group of individuals?
Yeah, in that situation, you can apply for a hardship waiver, or it's an interim recertification. And don't feel bashful about this. PHA has said that they has encouraged people that if they're facing a financial situation due to the pandemic, or as Khadib mentioned, if let's say you have other family members sheltering in place with you, and so the size of your household has changed, file for a hardship waiver, or also it's called an interim recertification. You do that one of two ways. One, go to PHA's website, pha.phila.gov, and if you scroll down about halfway down the screen on the right-hand side in the news section, it'll have hardship waivers, and go ahead and click on that. And then if you're in public housing, it has a list of links. And then if you get the housing choice voucher or the Section 8 voucher, the voucher that travels with you, it has a second set of links. Now, right now, the public housing online form is down. It's been down for a little bit, but the other form, the PDF form, is still up, and you can then email that to PHA instead.
I think that's really great information, and that actually applies, and people who are not only directly working with PHA, but might be on other subsidy. Any subsidy that you have that is tied to your income or household size, and there's been a change that has affected your ability to pay during this time, I think you should reach out to whether it's your case manager or the housing authority themselves and communicate that my situation has changed. I used to work 40 hours, I'm now working 15 hours. And I know that also ties in because we've spoken about that there is some delay in the system of people being able to qualify for, if they do qualify and receive unemployment. So being proactive and letting your landlord or housing authority know that maybe I need my rent adjusted for whatever the duration of that time period is because I'm now out of work, or the income that I had 6 months ago has significantly changed, or maybe I'm an essential worker and I can no longer go to work because I've got someone who's susceptible at a higher risk in my household, and the risk is not worth the finances that would come in as a result of that. So I think that's super important information to put out there. I think the kind of what I want to talk about is right now, is there any specific documentation? Because I know we're talking about be affirmative with your request for whether it's a hardship relief or just an income recalculation. How should people document that? And I think now's a great time to have that conversation, because as things progress, documents become harder and harder to find. So what should people really be providing to these various agencies?
Yeah, I mean, really, it's kind of a case-by-case basis, right? Because it depends on where your income comes from already. It depends on what income documentation they have. But essentially, put together a packet of all the information that you think that you might need. Like, let's say you've just received an email from your boss saying that you've been furloughed, but that's the only documentation you have. Submit that, and then essentially once PHA goes through and looks at the application, if they need more information, they'll follow up. But it's better, I think, to file just like how we've seen with the unemployment office, how it's been essentially flooded, and it's been taking a while for them to get back to people. Even if you don't have all of the documentation immediately, I'd say all the possible documentation immediately, I'd say file for that hardship waiver. And then if they decide that they need something else, they'll follow up. But get that in as soon as you can. Once you have that hardship, or once someone else moves in, send in that application and get that recalculation of rent.
Sorry, I want to take a quick pause and see if there are any questions from any of our participants as we kind of talk through these issues that I know can be super complicated and super hard to navigate yourself. Also, remind people generally that the Philly Tenant Hotline is available to provide you with legal representation or just legal information if that is what you need. So if anyone has any questions, we have both the Q&A and chat box open. Not sure who is listening in, but if you do have a question and you want to put that in anywhere, just put it in. I see we've got, or let me know.
While we're waiting for a question, I do have another quick thing that I was going to circle back to, which is
go right ahead.
One of the things that we saw, well, one of the things that we see right now, right, is that the courts in Philadelphia are scheduled to reopen on June 1st, but the CARES Act extends till July 25th. There's a significant period between those two. When the courts open up again, or are projected to open up again, and when the eviction moratorium, the CARES Act eviction moratorium period ends. And so one of the things that we may see is that there may be landlords who, they can't evict you for non-payment of rent, but just as Ornette said, they can try to evict you for some sort of violation for your lease. Now, we might see, I guess, essentially, small nitpicky things that, landlords are going to try to use. If you end up in this situation where your landlord is I guess we could say unjustly trying to use some part of your lease to evict you when really they're trying to evict you for not paying your rent, call the tenant hotline, 267-443-2500, and one of our advocates will be able to assist you with that situation.
I think that is great. And I think this is kind of the point in the conversation where I would like for us to just do a quick recap. It's been a lot of information, even though it doesn't feel like it's been a very long time, but it's been a lot of information that has been provided in this time. And I want us to just kind of go through really quickly. And Vikram and Ernie, you can both feel to join in and share additional information. So the major gist of the CARES Act eviction protection is that 120 days that started on March 27th and runs through July 25th or 27th, July 25th. So that's the major protection. There's that 120-day time block where if you are in a property that is directly federally subsidized, or if your landlord has a federally backed mortgage, you cannot be evicted or removed from that property during that time. In addition to that, the courts in Philadelphia are closed through at least June 1st. So if you are now being threatened or faced with any sort of eviction action, that is considered an illegal eviction, and there are advocates standing by to address that issue. So I think it's great for people to be aware of that. Also, just generally, and I'm kind of trying to find the outline that I was just reading from here. After July 25th, there's that additional 30-day notice that's required for your landlord to initiate an eviction against you. And these are for cases of non-payment only. It doesn't cover if you are at the end of your lease term or if you are in breach of a condition of your lease. Maybe you have a pet in violation of the pet policy, you have unauthorized occupants in violation of the occupancy policy. And I think if you have occupants related to COVID-19, you should proactively reach out to your landlord and make them aware of that situation so that I think most people are generally aware that we're in the middle of a pandemic and people's situations change from day to day, but just so that they're aware that you have this temporary person staying with you because COVID-19 is happening and people are being affected differently. And I think, as Ornette said, if you want to know if your landlord is in a covered property, ask the question. If you are in that group of people who are not directly receiving a federal subsidy, or you don't know that you're, let's say, in a LIHTC property that's federally subsidized directly, you don't have direct access to that information. So the approach should not be hands up, CARES Act covers everything. You should proactively engage with your landlord around your issues and be as forthcoming as possible. Don't overpromise. Get whatever you are asking for in writing. Text messages do suffice, but if you can both write an agreement, I know social distancing may prohibit you from both being in the same place at the same time, but if you can get an agreement together, then you should do that. And that's some very good information to have as you go through the court. And for people who aren't covered, it's if your landlord initiated an eviction case before March 25th. That's a golden date that you should have in your mind. So if you've got eviction court papers, even if your hearing has been postponed, if it was scheduled or filed before March 25th, you are not covered by the CARES Act eviction moratorium. So you should be aware of that. And also, if you are being evicted for something other than non-payment of rent, the two things that people should really keep in their minds are March 25th and non-payment of rent. Those two things kind of go together in like an interwoven way for tenants in these properties, because if you don't meet both requirements, then you're not covered. And additionally, if it's something other than, if it's filed before then, or it's something other than those things, it's just not within the CARES Act. And of course, federally subsidized properties, or properties that are not directly federally subsidized, but where your landlord has a mortgage that may be federally subsidized, be proactive, open the conversation, and still reach out to the landlord as your own advocate and let them know what's going on. I think I want to wrap up with a brief discussion, and this mainly applies to people who are in Section 8 or housing authority type properties who are in need of emergency repairs and maybe tempted to, let's say, withhold rent or not pay what their actual portion is because they're seeing a repair that needs to get done and they're just like, well, I'm struggling, I need this done, you haven't done this yet. What's the process for that? Just so we can keep people up to date on that process.
Sure. Yeah. So even if you're not paying rent, and you're able to stay in the property right now because of the CARES Act, because there's the eviction moratorium until July 25th. It doesn't mean that that your landlord or PHA or whoever isn't supposed to be making emergency repairs. They're still required to hold up their end of the bargain. Essentially, right, a lease is an agreement. You agree to abide by your part, they agree to abide by their part. And even if you can't pay rent right now during the moratorium, they still have to make emergency repairs. So for people when Section 8, with a housing choice voucher, voucher that travels with you to a different place, call your landlord. And for people in PHA public housing, you can call the call center, PHA call center, which is 215-684-8920.
So I think there's a question from at least one audience member over on our Facebook Live that wants to know if, and this seems to be someone who's in a partially subsidized property, if they should still pay their portion of the rent if there are repair issues. And I know we talked about emergency repairs, but maybe now would be a good time to just explain the repair process in terms of potentially withholding rent or the notice that you have to give your landlord if those issues come up.
Yeah, so I mean, while tenants do have a right to withhold if repairs are not being made, we really do recommend that if you can, that you pay your rent if it's possible, because when you don't pay your rent, then you're putting yourself at risk of, getting served with a notice. Now, because if a person is covered, then, they have that kind of little bit of that buffer, but there is still a risk, of course, once that July 25th date comes up, and then, a person could be served with a 30-day notice. And as Vikram was saying, once someone files a case against you, it's open, even if you're able to win. So yeah, we do recommend that if you can, pay your rent, even through the, trying to get the repairs made. So that you don't put yourself at risk.
So I think there is a question also in the chat box about, well, firstly, I kind of want to add on a little to what you said, Oronit, is that if you're a tenant living in a property and you have a repair issue just generally, and it's not an emergency repair where like you don't have running water, you don't have heat, it's just a run-of-the-mill, my cupboard's broken, and you want to get that repair done, you should send notice to your landlord, usually in writing, making this repair request, and allow some reasonable period of time for that to be done. Bearing in mind the fact that we are in a pandemic, and just like you may be experiencing issues on your side, the availability of people to come out and do repairs is somewhat limited in this time window. So be reasonable with the request and the amount of time that you allow to pass before you start withholding rent. And if you can't, if you've sent the notice to your landlord and they've responded and said, maybe it's going to take me 2 weeks instead of 2 days, I think that's something that you should bear in mind before you begin the process of making the decision whether or not to withhold rent, just that the expectation is going to be that you allow the repair to be done. And of course, L&I is an option. You can call them. I don't know if they're specifically doing inspection on non-emergency issues right now, but you can call them and at least get in the queue so that they can come out and inspect your property, hopefully after the moratorium is over. And if there's still outstanding repair issues, that's additional evidence that you have to support any claim that you may have raised on those issues. And I think their question that I want to pivot to out of the chat is, what about not paying your rent beyond the moratorium? So on July 25th, we've kind of said that's the first day that your landlords are able to file cases against you. But as we know, the realities of the situation is July 25th, people may not have returned to work. People may just be getting back to work and can't pay the rent that is due in August. So what should people really do at that point in time? Is there any protection beyond July 25th?
I think the CARES Act protection ends on July 25th. And so if you're in a situation where you can't pay your rent afterwards, first, try to work out a payment plan with your landlord. If that's not working, then there are some organizations that you may be able to apply to for rental assistance. You can go to our website, phillytenant.org, and we have some information there with regard to numerous organizations in the city that do offer some rental assistance. Now, at the moment, some of those organizations, because of the pandemic, are a little bit more, strapped, at least as far as the work goes. Everyone's working from home, so you may not necessarily get a response quickly, but it's still worth reaching out to them if you do need rental assistance. But after the moratorium ends, if you haven't paid rent during the moratorium, between March 27th and July 25th, even though you can't be evicted during that time, you do still owe that rent. And so you will have to work out something with your landlord or get some sort of rental assistance in order to pay the rent for a period, which I know is tough, especially because a lot of us are out of work. We're still waiting for unemployment benefits to come in, which is why open communication with your landlord is so important.
I couldn't agree more. There was a question about kind of the properties that are covered, so I just want to put it back out there that if you are living in public housing, Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program, if you are a HUD multifamily housing program, including Section 8 and project-based housing and or senior housing, you are also covered. Continuum of care permanent housing or transitional housing, if you are a HOPWA or home funded housing recipients. Also people in the low income housing tax credit light tech programs, you are also all covered, in addition to individuals whose landlord has a federally backed mortgage. So I would say if you are confused, feel free to call us 267-443-2500, and an advocate will get back to you within 24 to 48 hours and can answer all of your questions. But the thing that you can do for yourself right now is to look at your lease agreement. If you are in a subsidized program of some sort, there's usually an addendum or an agreement that's separate between you and the housing authority or agency, and that will give you some indication as to whether or not you live in some sort of subsidized property. And if you do, you should reach out to both your landlord and the housing authorities and communicate whatever hardships you may have. And if you are just a private renter out there on the open market and you want to know, am I covered? Ask your landlord the question. I think it's something that landlords may be proactively looking into for themselves, just to make sure that they continue to be on the right side of the law as they try to proceed in this, and negotiate. Reach out, ask the question, put an offer on the table once it's an offer that you feel comfortable with, and get it in writing. It doesn't hurt to do that at all. So as we wrap up, I want to give both Orani and Vikram an opportunity to give any final closing remarks or plugs that they want to get out there. So take it away.
I did have a quick addition to the thing with landlords and asking a landlord about a federally backed mortgage, which is to your your landlord may not immediately offhand know whether or not they have a federally backed mortgage. And so if they don't get back to you immediately, or they say, I'll get back to you on that, be patient with them. Mortgages can be complicated. Mortgages are repackaged and resold. And so it may not be something that your landlord immediately knows offhand, but it is something that they have access to find out.
Great.
I think the last thing I want to say is, this is a hard time, and we're all feeling the uncertainty and the chaos. And so before taking any action, get all the information that you can. Reach out to us on the hotline. Stay connected to your family and friends. Take care of yourselves. And reach out to us so that we can provide you with any resources that you might need, so that you can make the best decision for you. Thanks so much for tuning in.
Thanks. So just as we wrap up, I want to let people know that all of this information is available on phillytenant.org, www.phillytenant.org. That's a great resource that you can go to and kind of self-educate. Additionally, we have given you our hotline number, 267-443-2500. Feel free to call us, even if you just have a question. You're not locked into legal representation. We're here to help and give you the most up-to-date information that we have. We will be back next week with a new edition of Tenant Tuesdays at 2. We're hoping to talk about utility issues next week that our tenants and homeowners alike will be facing. So I want to take this opportunity to thank both Vikram and Oranit for joining us today and guiding us through this conversation. We hope that you, as the general public, found this information useful. And if there are questions that you have, feel free to comment on our Facebook Live feed, or there is a registration link on Philly Tenant. You can send in your questions in advance of next week's edition. But we really thank you for taking the time out of your busy days to join us and hear what we have to say. And we're standing by to help you in every way. Thanks.